Bonjour à toutes et tous. Nous sommes très heureux de vous
Hello,
accueillir à la
everyone. We're
conférence sur le
delighted
rôle du secteur financier
to have
dans
you
notre
at this
thématique.
conference on the
Il
role
s'agit
of the
d'un cycle de
financial
conférences
industry in
qui
combating
est
climate
organisé par le
change in Africa.
partenariat
This is a round of
des banques de
conference
France et
which
de
is being
FERDI en
organized
collaboration
based on
avec
a partnership
l'Agence
between the Banque de
française
France and
de développement.
FERDI with the
Et comme
cooperation of the
lors de notre
French
première
Development
conférence sur
Agency,
le climat,
AFD. And
eh
similar
bien,
to our
cette
first
conférence
conference
prend
on
la forme
climate,
de trois
this
séminaires.
conference
Un
will take the
premier
part
aujourd'hui
of
sur le rôle du
three
secteur
webinars. The
privé,
first on the
un
role of
demain
the
à
private
14 heures
sector
mardi
tomorrow at 2 p.m. This
sur
will
le
be
rôle des banques
Tuesday
publiques de
on the
développement.
role of
Et
the
le dernier mercredi, auquel vous
official
aurez probablement
development
pu tous
banks.
convier,
And on
sur le rôle des banques
Friday,
centrales.
the
Avant de
focus
commencer
will
le
be on the
séminaire
role of
proprement
central
dit,
banks.
j'ai l'honneur
Before
de
we
partager ce
actually start
plateau
the webinar,
avec Madame
let me
Benassi
introduce
Quéré, sous-gouverneur
Madame
de la Banque de
Benassi
France,
Quere, who is
Patrick
Deputy Governor of
Guillaumont,
Banque de France, as
président
well
de
as
la FERDI,
Patrick Guillaumont, the
et
chairman
enfin
of
Thomas
FERDI,
Bellogno, chef
as well as
économiste pour
Thomas
l'AFD.
Bellogno, the chief
Et tout de suite, je
economist
laisse la
of the
parole
French
à Madame
Development
Benassi Quéré.
Agency. Over to you, Madame Agnes
Merci beaucoup.
Benassi Quere.
Bonjour à
Thank you
tous,
very
mesdames,
much.
messieurs,
Hello,
chers
everyone.
collègues, ici
Dear
présents et
colleagues,
en ligne.
and
C'est
all
un
of you
grand honneur pour moi
online, it is a
de
great
ouvrir
pleasure
cette
and
conférence,
privilege
un plus
for
grand
me
plaisir
to open
d'accueillir
this
ici
conference, which
au
we are
lab de la Banque
hosting
de
here
France.
in the
Donc le
lab
lab
of
qui est
Banque de
un
France.
laboratoire
The
d'idées
studio
qui
or
va
the
nous
lab
aider
is a lab
en
of ideas
permanence
which
à
will help
trouver des
us
idées innovantes.
to brainstorm and come up with innovative
Le
ideas. Now,
sujet de cette
the
conférence, le rôle et
focus
l'impact
of
des
today's
intermédiaires
conference, the
financiers
role and
privés dans la
impact of
lutte contre
private
le
financial
changement climatique en
intermediaries
Afrique.
in
Et c'est
combating
évidemment un
climate
sujet
change in
clé pour la Banque
Africa
de
is
France,
a critical
notamment parce que
topic
la
of
banque
interest for Banque
abrite
de
le
France
secrétariat
because
du
Banque de
réseau
France
mondial des banques
has the
centrales et superviseur
secretariat of the
pour
global
le
network
verdissement
of
du
central
secteur
banks and
financier,
supervisors for
NGFS.
greening
Cette
the
conférence
financial
s'inscrit dans la
industry. This
continuité d'un
conference
premier
falls
rendez-vous
within a first
organisé en 2021 qui
meeting,
avait
which was
permis de dresser
organized back
un
in
état des lieux
2021,
des
which set
besoins
the
et des
scene
vulnérabilités
for
spécifiques
identifying
du continent
needs
africain
and
face au changement
weaknesses in
climatique.
Africa in the face of
Et donc
climate
cette
change.
année, nous
Now,
franchissons
this
une
year,
nouvelle étape.
we are
Nous
crossing
passons du
a new
quoi
milestone, going
au
from
comment.
the
Comment les différents acteurs
what
du
to
secteur
the
financier,
how.
les
How
banques,
can the
assurances, fonds
various
d'investissement et agences de
intermediaries,
notation
the
peuvent concrètement contribuer à la
investment
lutte contre
funds,
le changement
rating
climatique en
agencies, the
Afrique?
banks, and financial institutions can
Ce combat
contribute to
est
combating
collectif.
climate change in
Il
Africa.
exige
This is a
des
collective
référentiels communs,
fight which
un
requires a
langage partagé
common frameworks,
pour que les risques
common
climatiques soient compris,
terminology,
mesurés
and
et gérés de
language
manière
for
cohérente à
climate
l'échelle mondiale.
risks to be
Et
fully
c'est
understood
précisément
and fully
l'ambition du
assessed at the global
NGFS.
level. And this is
L'NGFS œuvre
the
à construire un
goal
socle
of
commun de
the
connaissances et de bonnes pratiques
NGFS, which
pour que les banques centrales et les
strives at
superviseurs
building
puissent intégrer les
common
enjeux
knowledge and
climatiques
best
plus
practice
largement
so
et
that
les enjeux
supervisors and
liés à la
central
nature
banks
dans la
can
conduite de leur mandat.
have the
Nous
instruments
devons
in
donc
place to
collectivement
combat
mieux
climate
gérer les
change.
risques
So it
économiques et
is a
financiers
need, there's
causés
a
par le
need
changement
of
climatique.
better
Je
collectively
mentionnais que
managing
le NGFS,
the climate
créé en 2017,
risks.
compte
And
aujourd'hui près de 150
NGFS, which
membres, un
was
bon
founded
nombre
in
de membres
in
des pays africains,
2017,
banques centrales et
has
superviseurs, et
many
va être créé là dans
countries
les
as
mois qui viennent
members, central
un
banks
groupe
and
régional
supervisors, and a
Afrique. Donc je
regional
vous engage
African group will be
à
set up
participer
in the next few
activement
days.
aux
And I
activités
do
du groupe
encourage
régional
you
africain.
to participate in the activities
Alors, je
of
souhaite
the
ici
African
remercier
Regional Group
chaleureusement les
of
membres africains donc,
NGFS.
du
I would like to
NGFS
welcome and
et
thank the African
les
members of
précisément 27
NGFS
juridictions
and
africaines qui sont
the
membres du
27
NGFS. Donc, il y a
African
encore de la marge
jurisdictions which
d'exploitation.
are members of
Et plus
NGFS. So there
également
are more to
membres
come.
la
And
BCAE et
there
la
is
COBAC, donc les
also
activités
COBAC
industrielles
and
plus gaiement
BCAE,
que ces 27
i.e., there are
juridictions.
more members than the
Alors,
27
cette
members I've just
mobilisation
mentioned.
témoigne
Now,
d'un fort
this
engagement du continent et
engagement
d'une volonté
reflects
de
a very
contribuer
strong
activement
commitment
au
from
verdissement du
Africa
système
to
financier
actively
mondial.
contribute to greening the global
De même, les
financial
banques
services
publiques
industry.
de
And
développement
the
veulent bien sûr de
official
l'initiative
development banks
Financing
under
Common,
the
animée par
Finance in
l'Agence
Common
française de
initiative,
développement,
which
joue un
is
rôle
being
très
headed up
important
by the French
pour
agency
orienter les flux
for
financiers vers les
development, plays a
trajectoires
key
durables.
role
Ce
to
sera l'objet, je
channel
crois, de notre
financial
webinaire de demain.
flows to sustainable initiatives.
Ces deux
And there will be
coalitions,
a
NGFS et
webinar tomorrow on
Financing
this.
Common,
So NGFS and
illustre
Finance in
la
Commons are
puissance de
two
l'action
initiatives
collective
which illustrate
fondée sur la
the
coopération,
power of
la
collective
volontaire
action
et la
based on
recherche de
voluntary
solutions concrètes.
cooperation and the pursuit for
Alors
concrete
la Banque de
solutions.
France,
Now,
comme vous le savez,
Banque
entretient
de
depuis
France,
longtemps des
as you know,
partenariats
has been
étroits avec les banques
maintaining
centrales
close
africaines
partnership with
à travers
African
des
central
programmes de
banks
coopération technique et des
via
échanges
technical
d'expertise
cooperation
et un
programs and
dialogue
sharing and
régulier sur les enjeux
exchanges of
monétaires,
expertise,
prudentiels
as
et
well as
climatiques.
regular discussions on
Ces enjeux
monetary
sont
and
précieux
climate
et
issues.
nous sommes fiers
These These discussions are very valuable, and we are happy to strengthen this momentum with this conference. Thanks to these relationships, we know that the African realities call for specific responses. The African continent is very vulnerable in the face of climate change, and based on the last short-term scenarios published this year by NGFS, extreme yet plausible natural catastrophes could count up to 12.5% of the African GDP, i.e. double that of the other regions in the world. So this is the most vulnerable regions against extreme natural catastrophes. The longer term NGFS scenario shows that the cost of non-acting against climate change is more onerous. And it is up to us to transpose this macroeconomic profitability pursued into microeconomic profitability with the engagement of the financial institutions. So there are major assets with Africa, with an exceptional potential, with renewables, dynamic youth, and of course, capacity for innovation, which is extremely high. So combating climate change can not be disconnected from the official development goals. It must be inclusive and it must be adapted to the local realities, which calls for recognizing differentiated responsibilities and need for adaptation, as well as the financial constraints and burdens on many African countries. This wide role of private financial intermediaries is critical. Without the robust development of a financial system, there won't be any sustainable finance, and we won't be able to combat climate change. So we now have been seeing promising developments. In 2023, the renewable energies became the industry which got the largest share of private investments in Africa versus conventional energy, which attracted only 4% of such investments. Now, this is a good start. Yet there's big leeway. Now, the credit market in Africa remains quite low, and private credit accounts for 35% of the GDP, with high disparity, 11% of GDP in Central Africa, 21% in Eastern Africa, and 65% in Southern Africa. Central banks and financial supervisors can and should support this development by making sure the macroeconomic and financial environments are stable and by providing a secure and robust framework for funding transition. A good management of financial risk by the banks, insurers, and other financial institutions will also contribute to the financial stability of the infrastructure as well as to the climate stability. But the action of supervisors and central banks should not substitute that of private operators and that of governments. The COP30 Conference of Parties, which will be starting in Brazil in Belém next Monday, will be a key milestone to accelerate the reduction of global greenhouse gas and emissions versus the so-called NDCs roadmaps will not, based on experts, prevent climate warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, the funding of transitions in emerging economies will be at the core of our discussions, including Back to Belém roadmap, which engages $1.3 trillion, including $1 trillion from the private sector. So the discussions today will be focusing on the levers for action by the private sector, innovative instruments, data standards, and climate taxonomies. These are key instruments to align financial flows with the climate goals of the Paris Accord, which we are celebrating the 10 years of. I'm convinced that the discussions will show concrete avenues for development which are adapted to the local realities. I thank you all for being here and for engaging in this effort. And I thank the various partners, AFD and FERDI, for their collaboration in organizing this conference. And I wish you the best discussion. Thank you. Dear Agnès, Deputy Governor, dear Thomas, Chief Economist, and Director of Innovation Strategy and Research at AFD. It's a great pleasure and privilege for me to open for the fifth time running this conference in partnership with Banque de France. This reflects a very close cooperation on development issues, and FERDI is very grateful for the action of Banque de France. These conferences are being organized every 2 years, and it is the fifth conference. Agnes mentioned the previous one on climate issues, which shows a continuity across the series of conferences. And it is a very visible illustration of our partnership between FERDI and Banque de France, which can be seen in the organization of many seminars, and with AFD, which is reflected in very strong cooperation between AFD and FERDI. And I'm delighted to see my friend Thomas next to us. For this fifth conference this year, we have adopted the format of a webinar on 3 days away from an in-person one-day seminar, which reduces the cost, but which limits some interactivity. But I'm sure we'll find the possibility to be interactive online and in this room. So I mentioned the previous conferences. Let me review the topics that were addressed during these conferences to show the continuity we have shown between Bruno Cadrillac, who is the CEO of FERDI, who will be with us tomorrow, and he played a critical role in those. And knowing that he was a former employee from Banque de France, and we're happy that he's come with us. In 2017, the topic was the response of the shortage of trade in vulnerable countries. 2019, foreign exchange policy versus sustainability policy in low-income countries. We even mentioned the role of Forex in CO2 emissions. And in 2021, more specifically, the conference focused on the financial choices for Africa in the face of climate change. Then in 2023, the topic was financial digitization to promote sustainability in Africa.
As was recalled, 4 years ago in 2019, we addressed the role of financial institutions and the Forex policies, and even a special number of one of our publications was in fact totally devoted to the follow-up after that conference, and several of us were actually invited by the Madagascar Central Bank to come and lead a seminar. Well, it wasn't just a seminar, it was a huge symposium for the 50th anniversary of the Madagascar Central Bank on this precise topic, the role of central banks in the responses to be found opposite climate change. And this cooperation with them, of course, has continued since. So this theme really reminds us of the third theme of our webinar on day 3. That's Wednesday. We'll be addressing the role of central banks and supervisors on all of this. It'll be the final theme, so to speak, the kind of umbrella heading of it all. Because, this program was devised by people here present, by Luc Jacolin, Florent Lyon, and Jean-Baptiste, whom I'd like to thank warmly for all the work they put in preparing and organizing this conference. And then the third webinar, I've just mentioned it, but the previous two, today's and tomorrow's, that is, will be addressing important matters too, as the sub-governor has just mentioned, will be addressing the role and impact of private financial intermediaries in the fight to abate climate change. And I cannot but mention in passing that in the panel for this first seminar, almost all of the speakers, the contributors, with the exception of the moderator, the lady moderator, and the representative of the Central Bank of Morocco. They're more or less all from FERDI otherwise. And not because they're from FERDI, it just so happened that they were in Limba, in a venue where we've been accustomed to working. They happen to be involved in that process. And we have Thomas Huss from the OECD who happened to be present, and we found ourselves together. And as luck would have it, we are the people who are actually the contributors at this conference too. So in this little list of people, I wouldn't like to forget our good old friend, senior fellow in FERDI, of course, Paul Derumeau. We would salute his fine, long-standing career. He's always used his freedom of speech, sometimes in constrained environments. And thank you, Paul, for being with us. And the second session will be devoted to the role of public development banks in the mobilization of funding, again, to abate the problems of climate change. And there we'll be addressing the allocation of resources, allocation of funding, the allocation, of course, of adaptation funds will be addressed there. And 10 years ago, we suggested to the Lima conference or general meeting, you were there yourself, we suggested that we should allocate adaptation funding as a function of the physical vulnerability to climate change. The idea was to put together an index for physical vulnerability to climate change. And this is a topic I'd like to flag up in the presence of Thomas here, that is the focus of joint research between FERDI and AFD right now. And that's a very good thing. So to go back to vulnerability, that's something that's close to our hearts here in FERDI. Of course, we've seen the 4 previous conferences addressing that, and this one too, of course, the allocation by public development banks. And it's not just allocating adaptation funds and taking care of vulnerability to climate change, but there's more to it than that. The idea is we've got to address vulnerability in all of its facets, structural vulnerabilities in all of the climatic and economic components. And sociopolitical dimensions must be taken on board too. This is our ongoing struggle, really, to fight against climate change. But in FERDI, our struggle is to fight against vulnerabilities in particular. That's the message I want to put across to you today. Thank you for being with us today and tomorrow and the day after too. And thank you in advance to all of those who will be contributing to our debates and will enable us to glean a thorough knowledge of all of these issues. Thank you.
Bien, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je voudrais à mon tour remercier la Banque de France pour.
On my own behalf, I'd also like to thank Banque de France for its welcome today, and thank FERDI, of course, which is a very important partner for AFD by its presence in Clermont and also via the work we do together on topics to do with vulnerability. I'm happy to be asked to talk about this topic that brings us together here today, because we have to note this important issue, in fact, several issues that need to be addressed. And this and the coming few days webinars will be very relevant on this. We're awaiting, of course, the upcoming COP event next week. And it's been 10 years since we had the Paris Accord. So if you look at the financial components of the Paris Agreement, commitments were given to devote 100 billion per year from historically industrialized countries towards developing countries. And that was to be called climate financing. Now, that figure was decided on because it reflected a geopolitical trade-off at the time of COP21. Also, it seemed to be within our reach. We had more than 50 billions of climate financing at the time. That's what the OECD said in 2015. So 100 billion seemed to be within our reach, seemed to be credible. But the Paris Accord didn't say at any point that the 100 billions would guarantee us that climate change would be maintained at 1.5 to 2 degrees of a temperature increase. So volumetrically speaking, it was credible, but it was not in line with another scientific reality, which is the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere. So we've got to capture as much as we're emitting, so as to stall the temperature increase to 2 degrees. So the period between 2020 and 2025 the period of the 100 billions, we knew would, I mean, even if we put in the effort, it would not be sufficient. So at the previous COP, it was set down that there would be 300 billions of climate finance that would reflect the scope of the 100 billions, but also a second target would be taken on board of 1,300 billions that this time would be volumetrically, let's say, more credible in terms of maintaining us within a 2 degrees temperature increase on planet Earth. So, when it comes to climate finance, the insufficient volume has always been a problem to come to terms with our needs. Volume of monies, of course. And then we will have, of course, negative flows coming in to further aggravate climate change issues. We've got to pinpoint these, identify them, and geopolitically speaking, the situation isn't quite the same as it was 10 years ago. It'll be perhaps harder than ever to keep a lid on the negative flows, which are further downgrading climate change issues. So also we've got to look at climate risks that must be factored into our efforts. And there was a whole gamut of problems that weren't resolved or were only partially resolved at the time of COP21, hence the importance of making a success of COP30 and the further COPs down the line so as to take account of the physical realities, carbon concentration to be controlled, and financial funding put opposite these ongoing needs. So we also have to take account of some skepticism that's around, but that doesn't change anything in terms of the concentration of CO2 to be kept under control. So funding is one of the elements in the equation that will help us to achieve what we need to achieve. Now, the other issue to be resolved is in the light of geopolitical tensions these days that are stronger between the North and the South, we've got to be mindful of the problems that can arise. When you talk about climate finance, in reality, people mix up mitigation funding, which is important too, of course, very important. That's what will determine the physical reality of the success of our efforts, and then the sharing of the burden of the expense that must be proportional to the emissions. And the second issue is adaptation, of course. After mitigation, adaptation. Whether you be in a hot country, a cold country, an arid country, a wet country, it's not quite the same ball game, let's say. So the issues to do with vulnerability will have to be put in center stage. So we also have to talk not just about climate, but mitigation funding and then adaptation funding to try and keep control over climate change. In the FD, we're an important player in all of this, and the FD represents 6% of what's done, and we're proud of that. But sometimes you're not comparing like with like when you're talking about mitigation and adaptation. The other thing is that I would say we should have a critical mind about this conflict that goes on between climate and development very often. If you look at things from the climate perspective, you're creating a certain fogginess. When it comes to mitigation, very often it's funding access to energy that must be decarbonized. But you haven't got the climate on the one hand and energy on the other hand. You can fund access to energy at low prices, affordable for people, and have it decarbonized or with a very low carbon input. And when it comes to adaptation, I'm not quite sure how we can do rural development if we're not in line with current reality climate-wise. You've got to adapt to real-life conditions the whole time. So be it mitigation or adaptation, there's no strong contradiction there. However, the geopolitical challenges will sometimes, prevail on people to put their weight on one side or the other, whereas they're not in conflict. Now, there are twin objectives that came out of the Baku COP, 300 billions of funding from the public sector and private mobilized by the public sector, and then 1,300 billions from a broader background, broader sources, and why not have carbon credits, even though that situation hasn't stabilized yet. But this is the scope of private funding to be mobilized additionally to public financing so that we can reach volumes that would be credible given the size of the problems to be addressed. And my last message is, yes, let's work more on the framework to host private funding. but the public development aid isn't always doing that very well. Climate finance is handled a little bit better. We, as a development bank institutions, haven't got many ways of incentivizing private parties, and we haven't really drawn the consequences from the climate issues with respect to the rules and the objectives, financial targets that are set down for development banks in OECD countries like AFD, like our organization, or in other countries. So we've got to give thought to the framework, the financial rules that can guide the action of institutions that can leverage certain tools and mobilize crowd in private funding, as the World Bank, AFD, and others, issuing instruments on the market, mobilizing billions per year. Not so true on the project level, of course, but the fact is development funding doesn't factor in enough the different possibilities of mobilizing private funding. So I don't want to impinge too much on your time because I know you have a lot to say, and I'd like to thank all the organizers and wish you excellent debates, and thank in particular all the people attending online, especially people who've come from the African continent, who've come a long way to be with us today and who'll be making very interesting addresses, I'm sure. I'll be listening very attentively. Thank you.
Bonjour à tous, bonjour à toutes. Je vais être la modératrice de ce premier webinaire.
So I will be the moderator for this first webinar. I'm delighted to now be part of FERDI, and this is why I'm here today to address the role of the private sector. I would like to call our panelists who gave us the honor of being with us for more than an hour and a half. First, I would like to call Mr. Ali Mbaye.
Oui, oui, très bien, super. Donc, Ali est recteur de
Ali Mbaye is the rector of the Sheikh Anta Diop University. Delighted to have you with us, sir. You are going to be giving us the Senegalese perspective. Then I would like to call Aude Various to the stage. Aude is the director of the Green and Sustainable Hub at the CNP Assurance, which is an institutional investor from France. Then Thomas Hoss from OECD and from the TOSSD effort. Thomas Hoss is a principal analyst at the TOSSD Secretariat, the Total Official Support for Sustainable Development, TOSSD. And we have online Mr. Nabil Badj, who is the Deputy Director for Banking Supervision at the Banque Al Maghrib, the Central Bank of Morocco, who is online with us. Hello, sir. Delighted to have you online with us. So, right, these are our panelists. We also will have with us Paul Desrumeaux, who was the president of the Bank of Africa, and we will listen to him for his introductory remarks. Paul Desrumeaux, you have the floor. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your introductory remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, let me first thank the organizers for inviting me and giving me the honor of doing these introductory remarks. And it is for me an opportunity to meet again a number of friends, including Patrick and Sylvia Guillaumont, whom I met a lot in Africa, and so many more. This invite is a double challenge for me. I'm a commercial banker, I'm an economist, I'm not a specialist of climate finance. And I am mainly a local practitioner who has been an entrepreneur for more than 40 years in Africa and in Mali since 2006. Of course, these specifics will show through my presentation, knowing that I will converge with the two previous speakers, Patrick Guillaumion and Thomas Melonio, possibly with different conclusions, and I hope it will be useful for our webinar. I would like to mention 5 contextual factors which I find of importance before I review 3 examples which I find valuable. The first factor is that Africa, compared with the rest of the world, has an economic weight which is 4 times lower than what its population and what its size is. It has 2 implications. First, Africa and its population suffer from the global warming more so than they contribute to it. And the correction of this economic delay is and should be a primary goal for the governments and the citizens in these countries. So the climate and development policies have to be incorporated and integrated in order to succeed on both ends, knowing that the African continent shouldn't be anymore considered as one indivisible blocks. All problems and solutions are interchangeable. There are a number of specifics, including in sub-Saharan Africa. So equity and effectiveness justifies that many subjects should have national strategies which should take into consideration the local specifics. And there's a huge gap between the announced needs and the amounts of the programs which are being financed, which means why there are tensions in each conferences of the party. In 2022, the estimated financing basically were meeting only 22% of the needs which were expressed. And financing will even become lower due to the climate skepticism of the new American president-elect. So even though the numbers presented by scientists are more and more dire, it is important that we be more realistic in this confrontation of numbers. And there's a fourth factor, which is that of the importance and even predominance of mitigation investments to adaptation investments. It is deplorable that adaptation investments are a minority. And to pick up what Mr. Melonio said, mitigation and adaptation investments are, to me, response and counter-offensive type of investments. So offensive type of investments should be more desirable. And I hope I have time to address this. Finally, the African banking industry is one party which is absent from the financing circuit. The capital flows from many international, bilateral, and public institutions, as well as those by the African institutions like BOAD and BAD, have significantly increased, building upon better adapted financial infrastructure. The commercial African banks account for only 15%. But this could change because most African sub-Saharan banking systems are less than 50 years of age. They were built according to principles that are totally new, which in the past could not be envisaged, both by way of their shareholding structure and the way they do things or their target groups. Today, as they have become very profitable and very powerful, they compete with international banks in the African continents, many of which having retrenched. They are a concrete example of the success of a breakthrough and disconnect policy, and their goals should make them a significant instrument for the future funding of climate change. And I would like to mention three examples: access to electric power, farming, and opportunities provided by crisis. These are my three examples. Now, the electric power generation is critical to combat climate change due to the CO2 emissions. And it is all the more important for development as Africa is massively lagging behind. There were many and heavy-duty obstacles at the technical and financial level, explaining why there is such a great delay. But the good news is that responses are gradually meeting some obstacles. There's a prerequisite which was removed, is that the public institutions can now provide technical assistance to the negotiation processes between African countries and the large operators. And the African Development Bank pioneered the way. So today, large investment projects in renewable energy has been booming. I have mentioned a few examples, as well as the giant La Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia, which shows the capacity for successfully pulling off such a project on the back of national funding. A number of countries are still investing into fossil fuels. The Mozambique, which is a major oil and gas producer, cannot follow the same path as Ethiopia. The challengers is about decarbonizing the economies over the long term, despite the fact that different ways and paths will be taken by different countries. And there's another new aspect in the context of strategic projects on the back of innovative financing instruments like the green bonds issued by BOAD in 2021, or recent securitizations of debt instruments for the electricity for all programs in Senegal and the Ivory Coast, and the solar power generation facilities have been a recent promise with splittable capacity from the large solar power plants to individual power generations. And technology has reduced the cost of this equipment. And there are three implications. Large-scale solar power plants have become very competitive. Number two, the off-grid technology, which is very appropriate to the rural needs, are very much sidelined, but are becoming booming. And the hardest to reach program by the Acumen Fund can be mentioned, which will provide accessible clean energy in 17 countries. And the solar power is of greater interest for urban populations. And the think tank showed how important it is to have this technology in rural facilities. For farming, good synergy between protecting against climate change and agricultural development policies should take into consideration the increase of production for the local communities. Even though it is difficult to establish such relationships, there are avenues which are being opened. One of those is that the large national projects are being implemented, and the agreement signed by the Ivory Coast and the Chartered Central Bank is a good illustration of this. So in the context of sustainability-linked finance in the amount of $500 million and falls with initiatives which have been introduced by the African Development Bank and BOAD in order to have increased resources in order to implement sustainability programs. Also, other initiatives of a more bottom-up nature focuses on irrigation capacity, which is another second factor, with irrigated surface areas only accounting for a small part of cultivated areas, even though there's hydric potential, which is much higher. The increase of this hydraulic potential would increase the volumes farmed and produced, and productivity would reduce deforestation and could prevent and slow down rural exodus. There are so many avenues and so many solutions, despite the fact that they are low financing, and so hybrid type of financing are options for lots of opters. Secured, refinanceable banking loans, green bonds which can be extended, cooperation with institutional and national operators, building upon local communities. So there are hopes with intra-African cooperation efforts like the installation in Senegal of Kickstart, which is a Kenyan provider of low-cost irrigation equipment. It is also promising to see that crisis per se offers great opportunities. This was the case for Mali. Starting in late 2023, Energy du Mali, which is a public utility which distributes electric power, was confronted with huge financial issues, with massive power cuts across Mali. A new solution came about, and with the households and small companies in Bamako, the so-called autonomous solar panel equipment. Three factors explain the success: lower manufacturing costs, a desire by citizens to move out of poverty, dynamic response by the industrials. So a kit able to recharge a telephone and charge a lamp. More sophisticated is an integrated electric equipment of a large villa, including HVAC, which is the solution provided to my own home. These solutions were implemented by way of self-funding. And there is a rule which is often forgotten. When you have sound, effective financial systems, having that is not enough to promote change. It is only a prerequisite for these changes to happen at a larger scale. This may be the case thanks to the multiplying effect of medium-term banking loans, which are eligible to the guarantee facilities, but similar to mortgage loans, ad hoc specific vehicles could be used to refinance that, as is the case for home loans. These virtuous scenarios could be extended to other scopes like that of urban mobility. Households whose solar panel facilities generate excess power could use this excess power to recharge their bikes or their cars, or could help set up businesses. This can be seen in Nairobi, in Abidjan, or in Dakar. These examples are as many signs of hopes, yet do not call into questions the many difficulties nor the multiple issues to help combat climate change. But it shows that successes are possible as they recognize three principles of action, which seem to be critical: realism in the way needs are expressed, and commitment and engagement is formulated, the determination of each party and operator, and imagination as inspired by the field, and effective solutions which should guide the actions for everyone in the initiatives. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur Desromeaux. Merci infiniment.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir.
Alors, nous allons procéder au panel.
At this point, we will talk to our panel.
Qu'une session sur les questions
This session
sera animée à la fin, à la toute fin du panel.
We'll listen to the remarks of the panelists, and then we'll take questions and receive answers at the very end. Now, concerning what was underscored by all of our contributors for the moment, I'd just like to react to something that was said that will be addressed, I'm sure, by Ali, concerning the recent statements made by Bill Gates. So this debate is going on across the Atlantic too, concerning what the UN should focus on. Should it be emergency efforts, development efforts, and perhaps less climate action? This is a debate that's going on. And I just wanted to underscore it's something we'll be addressing with Thomas as well in a minute, concerning climate, mitigation, adaptation, funding of development as well. These notions are clear for some people, but perhaps not for everybody. So when we talk about the role and the impact of the private financial sector, firstly, we must note that there is great diversity of players, diversity of the African context too, of course, as somebody underscored, but also how can we measure the impact? How will we define the impact? Who will define the impact? And everybody's role in that context. Maybe Thomas Hoos will give us some perspectives here, kind of a helicopter view, so to speak, from the perspective of the TOSSD, the Total Official Support for Sustainable Development from within the OECD. You'll perhaps give us some statistical background on all of this. Thank you in advance, Thomas. Thomas Hoos. Thank you. Firstly, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me along today. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. I have prepared a small PowerPoint presentation to support me to act as a visual aid. It'll come on screen in a minute. Okay. It's not there yet, but it will come on screen very shortly. So it's there, it's ready to roll. So I'll start in the meantime, perhaps. Thank you. We have a remote control too. So I just wanted to make a short presentation on public support for sustainable development, total official support for sustainable development, TOSSD, and it's abbreviated to TOSSD. We have international statistics available that we summarize everything to do with development aid, sustainable development, all the data concerning public support for sustainable development and the challenges and opportunities within that. So firstly, we have the fact that TOSSD, has to meet certain challenges in trying to measure the funding available for sustainable development. So we have a first pillar, which is a cross-border funding flows, resource flows as we call them, and that's public development aid, and then pillar 2, global and regional expenditure. And then you see the arrow in the middle going towards all of the donors, the donor agencies, all of the monies mobilized by donors, and agreements on funding, be it bilateral, multilateral, South-South, cooperation, triangle cooperation, Islamic finance, and so on. And of course, TOSSD has a governance structure. We are governed by the International Forum on TOSSD. We meet in the form of a general meeting with members, observers, and rapporteurs. And we have 130 countries and international organizations that sit there. And the forum is, of course, steered by a steering group. You've got traditional suppliers, but also you have the recipients and international organizations that we've listed out here that are members of our forum, and then observers. Now, the technical work, statistical work, is done in the statistics working group. There's a secretariat that is hosted by the OECD for that. As I said already, we've got about 130 countries and institutions that supply us with the data, and we're talking about data at the level of each project, each activity, and Currently, we're talking about 1 million kinds of activity accessible online. So it goes into quite a lot of detail. And we encompass also more than 60 bilateral suppliers, as we call them, and then more than 66 multilateral organizations, 35 countries and organizations that have declared the private funding that they've mobilized. So TOSST, of course, takes care of financing for sustainable development. Each activity has to be notified with respect to the target under the Sustainable Development Goals that it forms part of. And also we collect and publish information on the environmental and social guarantees, so as to further clarify the status, the developmental status. Then the development of sustainable development is aligned with the United Nations definitions, as to support the processes within the United Nations. We look at the data in detail, and I just wanted to show you some of the detail to illustrate what I'm saying here today. We saw that during the period between 2021-2023, for example, per annum, the suppliers committed, not necessarily paid, but made a commitment to pay about $572 billion worth for sustainable development. And 27% was earmarked for Africa, for the whole continent of Africa. That is about $31 billion in US dollars committed as support to the private sector in Africa, non-concessional loans or investment stakes, that kind of instrument. And then about $9 billion of US dollars committed to support the private sector in the context of climate change. So that's about 2% only of the total package, according to the figures we have in TOST. So the private portion mobilized is fairly substantial in the context of TOST. When we look at the figures for the private sector in Africa, for climate purposes and everything else, and the countries that are the going to be the recipient countries of the funding are in Africa, of course, starting off with South Africa, as you see on the slide here, and other countries in North Africa too. These are the different countries concerned, and these are the countries covered there. Perhaps I should leave it at that for my presentation, but I'd just like to mention too that figures are one thing and talking about things is another thing, but you've got to put it all into practice and measure it. Maybe we're underestimating what's done or overestimating. You only know what you've measured, essentially. So we can talk about that later on in our debate. Thank you. Thank you very much, Thomas, for putting things in perspective for us, for zooming in on all of these matters from different perspectives. And this is one of the topics we will address, of course, in the second part of this panel discussion. So we will take an African perspective now, and from Senegal in particular, and we'll ask Ali to kindly tell us all about the work he's been doing on all of this. Ali, you have the floor. Thank you. I'd like to thank the organizers, as Mr. Mbai, the organizers of this conference, and the Banque de France, the AFD, and FERDI for inviting me along, for tying me in to this important debate. To try and answer your question and address the topic of the conference, I'd like to present a few points initially and then try and draw some consequences from what I'll have said before that. The first point that was important that came up is what is in what Patrick said, and the other speakers too. In fact, everybody referred to it. It's the low contribution of African countries to greenhouse gas emissions. These emissions are estimated to be 3.8% of the global figure. So the population, globally speaking, in terms of the global population, is not in the same proportion. That's not where it stops, though. The continent is characterized as being a climate hotspot. So the climate change effects, in spite of the low contribution of the continent, are in reverse proportions to what the continent contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. So Africa is hit harder than other parts of the world. Global warming is 50% faster, taking place 50% faster in Africa, it is said, than the global average. There are important facts to state. The second thing I wanted to say is the strong concentration of emissions in certain sectors. Firstly, we have energy, of course, electricity, power, industry, transportation. Even though the manufacturing industry's footprint is smaller in Africa than elsewhere, they're largely the contributors. Then you've got agriculture, stock breeding, and forestry, 12%. In these areas, everybody knows that with deforestation, of course, CO2 is given off into the atmosphere, and that's mainly driven by poverty. And the other third important point I'd like to make that came through in many of the contributions already is the low level of funding for mitigation and for adaptation. The aggregate in 2022 was $43 billion and a bit. That's very little compared to the needs of the African continent in terms of climate financing. I mean, 23% of needs between now and 2030, it's estimated, and also it's driven by public funding. Private funding is much lesser. So the mechanisms for the funding of these efforts, they're fairly identical to what you see for development finance in general. There are subsidies, grant aid, 13 billion, concessional loans, similar instruments, and it's basically the same mechanisms, the same instruments that are used, similar to what you see for regional development finance, whereas we should have more dedicated means. Now, not many donor agencies out there, AFD, of course, the Climate Green Fund, the African Development Bank, and then we have the innovative funding mechanisms like green bonds, for example. We have climate insurance and so on. These mechanisms remain marginal in size, marginal in importance for the moment. And another point is the great disparities we see, regionally speaking, within Africa.
Countries receive more than 50% of general financement. And the 10 least receiving countries receive 10% of the total. And 3 countries, South Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt, have been concentrating 76% of such financing flows. Now, what conclusions can we draw? First implications is something connected with climate justice. The amounts are very, very low. We are talking about less than 50 billion. If you look at the estimates using the DIVA model, the evaluation of needs for adaptation to rising sea level are basically at $300 billion, and we are less than $50 billion. So financing for climate change is very low. And then financing is asymmetric. We've spoken about adaptation funds, and the amounts channeled in this respect are less than $1 billion. Then the channels for mobilizing these financing are basically the official development channels, which are very complex, multifaceted, with criteria like the ability by government to pay back. But in fact, there should be more dedicated funds because these are facts which are provoked by other sources than the African parties. But they are financed using very classic and conventional channels similar to official development assistance. The last point I want to focus on is that the African countries, all things being equal, are confronted with many issues to access financing. In Senegal, the IMF reassesses debt to 132% of the GDP. So the debt has to be restructured. Otherwise, there's no way forward. But I won't go into the details of the geopolitical factors connected with debt. But climate financing, as I said, should take other ways, because for adaptation purposes, it's just a question of restoring the level of the country before climate change or without climate change. Unfortunately, the resources which are channeled in this respect are encroaching those other resources which are used to fuel development. So we need to have specific sources of funding for climate change and for all the other goals as well. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ali. So it is difficult not to mention climate justice and the fair distribution of resources and responsibilities. Now I'm turning to a central banker. Mr. Badre, I wanted to take some perspective on the way finance and climate issues have accelerated starting from 2015. You are a central banker, sir. Well, recent debate focused on the stability of financial systems, which is a key role and mandate given to all central banks. And as Thomas Host said, there was a great degree of confusion between management of risks and targeting and channeling of investment. So I would like to have your view as a central banker on these issues. You worked in the supervision side of things and on the regulatory side of things. Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be part of this panel, and I'd like to thank Banque de France, FERDI, and the French AFD agency to organize this webinar to strengthen the efforts of the international community to identify and respond to risk connected with climate change. So as a central banker, I would like to highlight what was mentioned by the Deputy Governor, Agnès Benassi-Kéré, saying that basically the response to climate change has been a growing issue by African governments. And I want to intersect this with financial regulation, the idea being to channel the right investments and the right funding into the climate-related issues and risks. Now, African countries, as was mentioned, are among those most vulnerable countries, like food insecurity, hydric stress. And in Morocco, we have a period of drought. And we also are confronted with the loss of biodiversity because there is a lack of technology and risks weighing on local communities. Now, there are three key drivers, according to me. There is the stability of prices, which is a key mandate, but most national central banks, which has an impact on climate change and on the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. The second mandate by the central bank is that of the management of monetary policy, which could be impeded by the physical perils, which deteriorates, impacts, and generates losses for financial institutions. And the third factor is financial stability, because any losses incurred by virtual, physical, or financial damages impact the financial assets. So the Moroccan bank, Banque Al Maghrib, has been a pioneering bank combating climate change. At the level of the Central Bank of Morocco, we've tried and come up with a more appropriate management of climate risks via three key actions. Number one, adherence to international networks. And Morocco was among one of the first countries to adhere to NGFS. And Morocco is a member of the steering group, and we contribute to the great work of this network, which provides very relevant information in many areas, which provides valuable information for global supervisors and central banks. With its two technical groups, the group working with climate-related risks and the other working group on the macroeconomic factors. So as a central bank, we have not a direct role to channel financing, but we have a role to make sure the credit and financial systems is resilient. And with respect to national cooperation, since the COP22 Conference of Parties was organized in Marrakesh back in 2016, the central bank coordinated the efforts of all stakeholders, including the Ministry of Finance, and based on consensus and voluntary approach, we set up a nationwide roadmap to guide and pool individual and collective efforts. And this roadmap played a key role since 2016 until today. And we worked collectively, involving all stakeholders, capital market operators, insurance companies, the various government agencies, including the Environmental Ministry and the Finance Ministry. And Bank of Madrid worked with the ministry to encourage the banks to adhere to the NDSC commitments via the regulation framework, to the extent that Bank of Madrid, since March of 2021, issued the first foundational risk of how to financially manage the climate-related risk, which is applicable to all banks and financial institutions, calling on those institutions to incorporate climate-related actions in their financing and investment decisions. And this instrument requires that bank accelerates the consideration for environmental and climate-related risks, including in their African operations. As you may know, Moroccan banks have several subsidiaries across Africa, and we want to make sure that the rules applicable to Morocco are being applied to the Moroccan subsidiaries of Moroccan financial institutions. So the first document was published in 2021, and it was supplemented by regulatory instruments which were ratified in 2025 in the context of the requests to the IMF for financial assistance. And two new documents were published. One document which requires that financial and non-financial reporting and communication be implemented by banks connected with climate risks. And we also require banks to publish their climate-related exposures. And we also worked in the context of strengthening the role of the central bank with respect to managing financial, non-financial risk connected with climate risk in the context of the supervisory activities. In this respect, we conducted an impact analysis reviewing a number of scenarios, including the NGFS published scenarios with the help of the World Bank. This exercise was conducted, which was the first in Northern Africa, which was an effort to try and better identify sources of impact of risks on the financial services and banking industry. And the analysis revealed that the balance sheets were very much exposed to the risk of flooding, of drought, due to the low carbon transitioning. And we are in an exploratory phase, in the second phase of the analysis, which we need to make more robust and to refine. In addition to this analysis, another effort was made was to strengthen capacity, because in the banking industry, in order to better manage the financial risks connected with climate change, we observed that there was a major need for capacity building. In this respect, we established an agreement with the European Reconstruction and Development Bank, which helped us by delivering modulable training sessions, with the first training sessions being organized. We are now delivering the second round of training sessions covering all banks, so that risk officers are being empowered and include these issues and requirements. And we also worked with new governance mechanisms in the context of our strategic approach. Inside banking supervision operations in Morocco, we set up a new unit in charge of managing these risks with an extended role, which was converted into a full-fledged department, so that it has a greater role and more responsibilities to make sure that banks are supervised with respect to climate-related risks and exposures. Thank you very much. So you have exposed to us the key roles of a central bank as being a very active member of the NGFS in a country which has been very much impacted by systemic risks and climate-related risk, with a banking system operating both in Morocco and in the continent. So we were able to have diverse views, giving us a general picture. Let us start with drilling down into the operators of the financial system, with Aude Veris from CNP Assurance, who is an institutional investor working more on the supply side, knowing that you are working in listed and unlisted operations, which is quite defining. As an institutional investor working with banks on the supply side, managing risks, which has both opportunities and risks. And Aude, can you share with us your experience with these issues, picking up what Nabil said about the ability to seize opportunities to better identify risk and how this is being implemented in the CNP operation? Thank you.
Hello. Yes. I'm really delighted to be with you here today, and it's a pleasure for me to represent an institutional investor. I'll tell you who we are, how we invest in sustainable finance, and why. I hope that will give you some pointers that will be interesting for you for the debate. Now, who are we for a start? Well, an institutional investor is a professional, of course, who has a portfolio of holdings like pension funds, insurance companies, reinsurance companies, regulated funds, Caisse des Dépôts, entities like that. EDF has a biggish portfolio. And these are professional investors that have a high volume of investments. And of course, they're professional managers. They have dedicated teams. We've got 130 people in our team in CNP. We have 320 billions managed in France, managed by those people. They don't manage everything in detail, but they work with the whole ecosystem, financial ecosystem, asset managers and banks. So it's a diversified portfolio in terms of the economic sectors and geographies. And finally, we've an objective concerning long-term holdings. We're a long-term player. That's critical for us. We invest taking account of sustainability alongside financial performance. So where do we invest then? If we look at our 320 billions managed here in France, we invest in all asset classes, that is for corporates and states. We invest fairly massively in the listed markets, the equities, bonds, listed funds, and also we invest in unlisted stocks that may be property, real estate. In Africa, of course, it's infrastructures, private equity funds as well, so as to diversify our holdings and achieve financial performance too, of course. So we work mainly in Euroland, in the Eurozone, and we invest in emerging markets by way of diversification. But we are interested in these markets. We have a large subsidiary in Brazil ourselves, and we work with them on the development of sustainable finance. One of the topics that's interesting for us is the fact that we have infrastructure financing, but also we take out stakes, holdings in companies alongside the Caisse des Dépôts, the CDC here in France, for essential goods and services in France. It's reflected in access to energy, grids, networks. I'm referring here to RTE, the grid operator here in France, Natron, which is a utility, a network, a grid utility concerning distribution of gas. And we support those entities in terms of their transition. So we try to play a role in supporting the private sector along the path towards the energy transition. Now, how do we do it? We've got a toolbox that we created 10 years ago that enables us to identify investments that we want to support. In our toolbox, we've got 5 pillars. Firstly, exclusion, then the integration of ESG considerations in selecting our assets. Thirdly, a pocket of very sustainable investments. Then, fourthly, how we manage risks, physical risks, transition risks in our investments. And fifth pillar, we commit to the companies we invest in so as to fast track the transition of their business model. A few facts and figures about those 5 pillars. The exclusions. We are exiting from coal, obviously. Clearly, there are lots of players doing that. We're not the only ones. 2040, exiting globally. 2030, exiting in OECD countries. And we exclude fossil fuels in terms of purchasing. We exclude investments in fossil developers when it comes to the value chain. An interesting pillar, too, is the integration of ESG considerations in managing our assets. We can filter these days the data thanks to data analytics. It's easier on the listed market, but we are managing to do it on the unlisted market too. We are accessing fairly robust data sets, and we use criteria concerning sustainability and green financing. We use criteria to screen the companies we want to invest in to see if they're close to our vision or far from our vision on these matters. Then we have a bucket concerning sustainable investment. Our objective is 25 billion of sustainable investment for the very near future. Green bonds, 14 billion, but property, infrastructures, and private equity too, in a more modest way. Now the risks. We do risk analysis in a general way, of course, in an overarching way. We're regulated, we're very much monitored on that. And we have a matrix for our risk appetite. It's called the risk appetite statement, the RAS. And we monitor metrics to do with transition risks and physical risks. That is the risk of loss of value, of having write-downs in our investment portfolio because of exposure to climate risks. And that is important because it's monitored by the regulator. Also, we should bear in mind that we are a regulated entity ourselves, and we, of course, work to European sustainability requirements with reporting that has to be done. We have an objective in terms of transparency, but also in terms of portfolio analysis. And that's what keeps 10 people busy the whole time. We have tools to track all of this. But the purpose of it all is to speak with one voice here in Europe, to have a common language when it comes to sustainability and especially the measurement of sustainability. That's what revolves around physical transition risk, but also we look at labels, recognize labels that we try to obtain for ourselves concerning sustainability, and then trajectories towards decarbonization. Now, we have phased out the concept of temperature. That was very fashionable 5 or 6 years ago because kind of marketing-wise, it sounds nice that your portfolio has a certain temperature, but we thought it was more worthwhile to have a pathway where you project yourself towards the future. And we've objectives we've set ourselves. We have joined the net zero asset holder alliance. The idea is we've set ourselves a stretch goal for 2050, but within our portfolio, we want to decarbonize. That's the idea. And have less, one half less within 10 years in our listed investments portfolio. Now, this is all published in our statement of purpose in CNP Assurance, because in France now you have your corporate objectives and you've got to state your sustainability objectives too. Now, ESG is part and parcel of our strategy and indeed our statement of purpose as an entity. And why are we doing all this? Well, we have to be exemplary, given our status. We are convinced that sustainability has to do with financial performance in the long term, a lot, and the strategic autonomy too. The factoring in of climate is important. Climate risk is important into investment efforts, and also it's a key differentiator. Of course, it's key for our brand image and our reputation, we feel. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Aude. Thank you for your testimonial. It enables us to understand the constraints that operators are subjected to. You've got to integrate regulatory constraints, long-term vision too, as an institutional entity. And institutional investors are a hugely important brick to the edifice we're talking about today, especially when it comes to the supply side or investments that are necessary for the transition. Now, we've touched on systemic matters, systemic players. We talked about regulation and supervision. And we'll try and put ourselves on the side of the recipients maybe for a minute. On the demand side, so to speak, the vulnerability side, the short-term side sometimes. So let's try and do that. Let's perhaps ask ourselves if the entities, be they governmental, non-governmental, whatever, if the entities are well served by this whole financial system, what exists in the private financial sector too. There are exclusions, as you mentioned too, addressed more and more, like entities by the UNEP, there are more and more exclusions. We've got to manage risk. That means avoiding the entities that are the highest risk entities sometimes. So I'd like to have Ali's opinion maybe on this balance. How can we get the balance right in this regard? Yeah, it's a very good question. You really have a point. To simplify, I'd like to go back to the basics. Climate financing has two main targets, hasn't it? First one is to finance mitigation, and the second one is adaptation. Now, it's a two-pronged approach, and both of these prongs are really strongly connected with the level of development at hand and the behavior patterns involved. Now, if you look at mitigation, as we said earlier, in Africa, mitigation emissions come from transportation, energy, farming, stock breeding, agriculture in the broad sense, including stock breeding, of course, and forestry. That's usually it. And if you look at energy, with the demographics, the dynamic demographics we have in Africa, ceteris paribus, we could expect the level of emissions to grow from that source and from all those sources. We look at deforestation also. So it'll be very difficult then to dissociate, to separate out mitigation from regional development policies. And regarding adaptation, it's the same thing, really. We can make the same point. There are sectors in difficulty that have become disaster zones. Agriculture, stock breeding. Look at the elevation of the height of the level of the sea. And basically, it boils down to saying that development challenges, given climate change, will be more and more substantial. And conversely, it'll have repercussions then on the objectives to achieve adaptation. And at the same time, climate funding mechanisms are not appropriate in terms of volume, but not appropriate in terms of the mechanisms used to mobilize the funding.
The African countries are finding it difficult to use the conventional investment flows and channels to fund fossil fuels. The African Development Bank and the AFD are finding it difficult to finance the conventional industries. The oil majors have been financing that, and by doing so, they are generating bigger challenges with respect to the sharing of resources. Now, this means that African countries have major difficulty to find resources to face up to both development financing and to the need for both mitigation and adaptation. In a report, in a paper published by Brookings, our argument is that the constraints with respect to financing fossil resources should be, how can I put it, should be alleviated and should be supported and framed so as to provide more leverage to the African countries that the international financial system does not give to the African countries. And they are so, and both is connected, adaptation, mitigation, and need for development. We have developed an atlas from the German, with the help of the German Ministry for Education and Higher Education. We wanted to publish a book on the sources of energy, including renewable energy. And the results are quite telling. They are 2,000 kilometers per hour of solar radiation per square meter for the Western African countries, which have been mainly the focus of this study. There are 17 rivers with catchment areas in excess of 700 square meters. So 350 gigawatts of wind power, the same for solar power and water power. So the potential to become net zero is here for the African continent. So you don't switch from a fossil energy system to a decarbonized system like this. You need investments, you need financing. The cost of financing is low and reduces over time. And over 10 years, Africa has lost 10 percentage points of savings capacity. So this, we should enable the African countries to use more instruments, to use fossil resources as a counterparty. The countries could commit to going net zero, but with the financing volumes which are available today, I do not see how Africa can engage in an energy transitioning process within the next 50 years. So I want the operators to be more realistic so that an energy transitioning program be engaged in due time, and we should be able to use available fossil resources to do so, so that restrictions at the international level does not make it possible for African countries to do that. So quite interesting what you're saying, because it reflects quite the diverging views of Aude earlier, which explains the policies and constraints connected with fossil fuels and Ali on the development imperatives. So it makes it emphasizes the difficulty of the equation. So going back to Nabil Badr, are you still online?
Oui, je suis toujours connecté. Je vous entends très bien.
Yes, I'm still online. I hear you very well. Nabil, you spoke about the risks in your first part. Can you give us your perspective as the Central National Bank by way of more aggressive policies to allocate and to target green financing flows or sustainable financing flows, depending how you call it, and how the stakeholders can be mobilized, while keeping in mind, of course, that there is an imperative to ensure a stable financial and price infrastructure, as you mentioned earlier. Thank you for this relevant question. I will show a slide which will be illustrating the key points in what I'll be saying. The first principle is that the action by the Central Bank of Morocco didn't focus on providing direct incentives, as I mentioned. We have a legal mandate which restricts the way the National Central Bank operates. At a strategic level, the bank supported the Moroccan government and the various associated stakeholders to successfully reach the Paris Accord goals and objectives. So with the stakeholders involved, we conducted a study with the help of the World Bank on coming up with the financing strategy by 2030, i.e. how to set up a financing framework which will enable the banks and the various public and private stakeholders to provide financing which falls within the scope of so-called green financing. In this context, we conducted a first study to identify the development potential, i.e. with respect to the NDC, i.e. $80 billion being earmarked as financing needs, half being for mitigation and half being for adaptation. And based on this, when we conducted a study to assess the financing requirements, we realized there was a gap in green financing, which is in the amount of $4.6 billion per year. So the goal is to see how the private sector can contribute more with more financing to the detriment of other stakeholders in the public sector. So the study was finalized and it was published in the third quarter of 2024, and the strategy was adopted in the context of the sustainability process with the help of the IMF. There are three major goals: to accelerate the financing of private projects to combat climate change and to fill the gap in financing to help Morocco successfully carry out its adaptation and mitigation goals, and to mobilize 50% of the financing needs in line with the best international practice. So as a key area in this strategy, the Bank of Madrid should align its prudential policy with the Basel standards, knowing that no standards is being adapted to provide incentive, but we'll see how we can align with some standards which could come up with new standards with incentives which would be adapted and appropriate to the prudential world. Number two, which fits within the green strategy by 2030, is that a taxonomy was defined and was implemented. Now, I mentioned the green financing, but it so happens that sometimes you have to define what is meant by green and green finance, jointly with the Ministry for Finance and the two regulators in charge of the insurance business and the capital market business. A strategy is being developed, which should be finalized by 2026, knowing that it's still work underway. The goal is to design a classification tool for screening and evaluation to avoid any form and type of greenwashing, knowing that it should be adapted to the Moroccan context. There is the European taxonomy in place, but what we are aiming to do is to take into account in this respect, there are 3 or 4 principles which should be implemented in defining and developing this taxonomy. The first is interoperability with other taxonomies. The second is with respect to the alignment with standards and frameworks currently being developed so that the deliverables can be compared and benchmarked with other work conducted at the international level. Now, with respect to the initial action taken with respect to managing the financial risk connected with climate change. Now, the stakeholders were very much made aware of the issues, and some banks have already developed climate-related products and services as well as risk management tools. Because, you know, when you implement a risk management tool, you are able to mitigate and better manage the risk you are talking about. And with respect to risk management, all banks have integrated, dedicated roles and units to manage these types of risks. Now, with respect to the financing needs, the green finance sector still shows a gap with respect to capturing those financing flows by international operators. So we consider that the key recommendation from the NGFS is with respect to the role of donors and multilateral development banks, which should accelerate the role they play and the contribution they have to support green finance. Now, there are three challenges ahead, which we've observed based on our experience at the Central Moroccan Bank. Number one, it is the way risks are being perceived. Very often, the financing gap is justified by the fact that the bank believe that the risks are not sufficiently mitigated, are not correctly managed, or there are not incentives in order to grant green financing flows. And we need to work on setting up a framework of incentives or guidelines and standards to better manage risks on risky projects. The second aspect is that with respect to the viability and insufficiency of demand. Insufficient demand means that these companies must be incentivized. And this is why, jointly with the government of Morocco, we are jointly implementing a framework for helping companies to upgrade their operating models to incorporate energy savings. So major work is being done in this respect. The third challenge relates to the lack of expertise and the need for introducing more complex tools, because companies which need to introduce such systems have to call on outside experts. But this type of expertise is not readily available. And so more mechanisms have to be put into place to facilitate all this. And there should be more risk sharing on the back of public guarantees, as well as raising the awareness of all stakeholders in the definition of the right tools and the right incentives. Thank you very much. Without further ado, I will give the floor to the audience if they have questions to the various panelists. I guess you have lots of questions. Who will give the mic? Nabil, are you still in line? Please stay online if there are questions to you.
Bonjour, merci. J'avais une question plutôt pour Madame de la CNP. Vous avez présenté votre portefeuille. Vous avez
I have a question for the lady from CNP. You presented your portfolio and you mentioned your subsidiary in Brazil. And could you tell me about the limitations? I mean, have you not gone elsewhere? Is it for regulatory reasons or what? Yes. Okay, this is a point I'll try and answer. Well, we invest very little outside of Euroland, and the emerging countries are diversification for us, essentially, in our investment base. At the moment, we have regulatory constraints regarding diversification. For a start, concerning the size of the investments, and secondly, the geographies. And it's Solvency II that prevails there. the European Directive, Solvency II. There's a high cost of capital. There would be high cost of capital for non-liquid investments, especially private equity. And that's a curb on diversification, geographically speaking. Now, this is changing a bit, though, because since last year, they've started to make changes. It hasn't gone to the French legislation yet, but what we see happening is there's a green factor coming in that will push institutional investors, insurance companies in Europe, for example, like ours, to invest in climate-related investments. That's a new possibility. It's going to be a new possibility. And another reason is there are green bonds that enable us to invest in Africa. So supra sovereigns, and that's a channel of investment that's sustainable and that's privileged by us right now, quite independent of considerations to do with greenium and so on. And then we try and support groups on their pathway to transition, and there are huge issues to address. That's a leitmotif the whole time in our conversations. And when there is a robust, deep market, we will be able to go there in the future. That's about it to sum it up, really, on my side, in answer to your question. Thank you. Thank you to our panelists for your presentations. I have a question myself concerning the development of the capital markets in Africa, because, indeed, we've talked about financing going to Africa, but the current challenge is how to mobilize savings in Africa. That's an important theme, I think, that will be addressed that is being addressed rather currently in Casablanca at the FEAS meeting. And there is quite a lot of saving done in Africa, and very often, unfortunately, these savings are invested outside of the continent. So what can we do to encourage African players, maybe the regulators, to channel funding towards Africa? And also, what can we do to invest monies more in the abatement of climate change problems on the African continent? So it would be good if African investors could invest in Africa, basically, and that would then promote the development of the efforts we're making to abate climate change, I think. Thank you. Thomas, yes. And then we'll have the answers. I have a more controversial question for Ali Mbaye. He was inviting multilateral banks to be a bit more just and go into fossil investments in Africa. But okay, there are majors and private players involved there, but it's a sector that is perhaps lacking in funding in the Western world. Why? I mean, are you saying that the public sector should step in where the private sector might opt out? In that sector, there is private money that could represent 90% of the investments necessary. I mean, in that sector, why should we reverse the order? Why? I mean, there are lots of private monies flowing into the fossil sector. So why would you like the public sector to go in there too? That's my question. So there's something that's come up too for Thomas, because there's something that we account for as cross-border flows that were mentioned, and the question of intracontinental mobilization, of course, comes up there in that context. How do you integrate that into your efforts? Is this a request you get from the recipient countries, is the question? Because often that predetermines certain things. So that's the way I'm interpreting the question that was raised. But maybe Nabil could chip in on that after Thomas to follow up and build on the answer, and then Ali to answer the other question that came just a minute ago. Okay, Thomas, well, I'll be happy to try and answer this question. In the context of TOSSD that I present, we measure public support for sustainable development. And it can be private financing, private to private, but that's not in our scope at the moment. I should say, though, that we understand I mean, sorry, we understand, and you should understand that we can't cover it all, really. Maybe we should build it into our scope in the future, but it would take time to get there. It's something that's not done by us right now. It's quite a lot, though. It would be quite a lot to take on. I'd also like to mention that what could be accounted for in statistics that we monitor would be the financing mobilized by the public sector. There are a lot of organizations and institutions that are really specialized in doing that. You know, development finance institutions, DFIs. That's what they do in many European countries. You see that going on. In France, we've got Proparco. You know, that's the kind of instrument that can be used, and you've got governmental guarantees that can be used in the northern countries, but it could be a multilateral development bank in Africa, the African Development Bank, and other entities like that could have that kind of instrument available to de-risk investments and then encourage those investments to stay in Africa. Also, if we look at what's happening through those instruments, well, we'd want to obtain data sharing from the institutions that manage those data, of course. We would need them to share the data. A lot of work would have to be done to make sure the data were made available. You've got states, but also you've got Africa Finance Corporation that works a lot with the private sector that would enable us to do nice graphs to show you what's going on, what the volumes are, and talk about the definitions and the metrics and why we count some things and not others. But we need the data, of course, to do that. Thank you, Thomas. That answers your question in part, I hope, anyway. And we've got to close very soon now. So the pull factors and push factors we've been talking about, especially when it comes to the capital markets. And Nabil, have you got any kind of an answer on those questions? Well, a couple of points, says Nabil. Firstly, the financing of the green transition cannot be just done by the public sector. It must be supplemented by other players. NGFS, as I said in my presentation, is there to encourage everybody on this. You've got blended finance that's necessary, private funding as well. And then we have those who have the expertise and the competencies that will be required to make big pieces of investment, and their help is needed. Then the use of the private sector. Now, we've done an assessment in Morocco, and we've seen that 25% of financing comes from private sources, whereas internationally, the average is not quite the same. So we've got to go beyond the figure we have so as to improve the amount of contributions from the private sector. And then regarding the capital markets, for the Moroccan case, we've had issuances of green bonds. But it so happens that since 2023, there was a origination done, and then it was discontinued. We don't know why the green bonds were not reissued now. Firstly, there's a cost. That's one of the reasons. You've got to engineer them, design them, and then the remuneration. And then thirdly, the part I mentioned earlier concerning demand. Is there sufficient demand to issue such bonds? And if the demand isn't there, we'd have to create the demand to create the need. Thank you. Thank you, Nabil. I think we've got 2 minutes before we close, or else we'll have to have just bilateral discussions after the event. Well, very briefly, says Ali. It's a very important question you've raised, but you shouldn't think that the exclusion of bilaterals and multilaterals will not have any impact on the annual flows. We can't leave financing just to the private sector. It'll impact the remuneration. But last year, what we saw in the budget, it was 140 billion CFA francs, I think. No, it was 70. So that's 140 million in dollar terms. And the most optimistic forecast for the coming years is 700 billions of CFA francs. It's a bit more than $2 billion US dollars. So I think that the fact that the bilaterals and the multilaterals might do this, it could change the whole ballgame when it comes to sharing out the remuneration. Okay. Well, thank you to everybody. Thank you to those who've attended online. And thank you for inviting me to moderate this session. Thank you to Banque de France and FERDI. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. And thank you to our panelists, of course. Thank you. Last word before we release you all. Just wanted to share with you that there were more than 400 people online attending this first day of our conference. Please spread the word. There are 2 webinars coming up tomorrow and the day after. And please come back again tomorrow and Wednesday. Now, we unfortunately didn't have time to pass on specifically all the questions that were raised online, more than 50, but we do hope that the panelists have given you some answers to some of your questions. Thank you to everybody and see you again tomorrow at 2 o'clock in the same place. Thank you.